I had tons of time to really spend, look at each song, look under every nook and cranny in my, song ideas to make sure everything was completely polished before we went into the studio. So we had tons of time to make things just right.
In 2021, Tremonti returned with his fifth studio album, Marching in Time. There's not a whole lot to distinguish this album from the previous releases. The songs follow a similar structure to songs on previous albums, and they follow one of two styles which are both typical for Tremonti. You have your hard rock songs and you have your ballads. Speaking of ballads, there are way too many on this album. This album is half heavier songs and half softer songs. And hey, this may be a personal preference thing, but that's what a review is. I don't like albums where the band goes soft for half or more of the songs on that album. I tune an album out really quickly whenever a vast majority of it is filled with softer tracks, especially when those tracks are all in a row. And with this album, it's definitely not balanced correctly. Most of the heavier songs are grouped together at the beginning, and most of the softer songs are at the end. 4 out of the last 5 songs on the album are soft songs. Pretty much puts me to sleep. I don't mind 1 or 2 softer songs on an album, but 6 is way too much. And out of the heavier songs, most of them are pretty much teases. A lot of these tracks start off with really heavy and fast intros that make you think you're going to get a really badass heavy song. And while they're still reasonably heavy for Tremonti, by the time the verse kicks in, the guitars are toned down a lot, either not playing at all for parts of the verse or just playing a chord and letting it ring out. It's rare that you get a consistent riff throughout the verses in these songs. And when you do, it's not nearly as good as the opening riff. The songwriting also feels like it's a little bit weaker than previous albums. I noticed a lot of choruses that just don't hit like I can tell they're supposed to. And that's not to say that this album is bad. There's only one song I actively dislike on this thing, and that's the first Tremonti song I've ever come across that I can say that about. And that's not until the last track on the album. So it's still a pretty decent hard rock album, there's just not a whole lot to distinguish it from the previous releases. Tremonti's voice sounds better, but I think that's coming from more experience singing. He's got a good voice, but I don't think he's got a whole lot of range or ability to do different things with it. So we don't see him try to pull off any new styles or do anything interesting with it. But he does sound good for what he does. The musicianship is competent, but it doesn't really stand out. And the album has this been there, done that feel. Everything's put together pretty well, and you can tell the band is getting better with each release, but they're not doing anything different. So let's go ahead and track by track this thing.
When I presented all the songs to my producer, that was one of his favorites. And after we recorded the whole record, I was like, you know what, we need to, this would be a great lead-off track for the record, but a lead-off track without a guitar solo in it might get people upset with me. So I had to write a solo for that record after the fact. After we had recorded all the rhythm tracks and everything else, I had to go back in and rewrite or write a solo to put on the end of that song. So that initially that song didn't have any solo.
The album opens with one of my favorite Tremonti songs, A World Away. This song starts off with some muted chords before going into a heavier section. The verses are pretty slow paced and go back to the style of the opening before going into a more melodic and faster chorus. The time changes in this track work pretty well together. And after the second chorus, the bridge gets very melodic and slows down. And all of that comes together nicely. My only issue with this track is with the typical Tremonti song structure, putting the guitar solo at the end of the song instead of in the middle to break up some of the vocals a little bit. But that's something he's been doing since album number 1. I still like how everything comes together, and this ends up being a really good track and a really good opener for the album.
Wake, a brand new day, another chance is torn away.
Now and Forever starts off with a pretty groovy and up-tempo heavy intro. I really like the tone that sets for the track. The song does keep a pretty good pace throughout the verses and chorus. But unfortunately, the first half of each verse, instead of playing a badass guitar riff, Mark plays this annoying guitar lick. In the second half of each verse, he comes back with a guitar riff, and it's pretty solid. I wish he had just gone with that throughout the entirety of both verses instead. The chorus seemed a little disappointing to me at first, but after hearing the song a few times, it has grown on me a lot. I actually really dig this track, even with my complaints. Although I can really feel the issue with the guitar solo placement in this track. Like I said before, it's typical Tremonti song structure, but it's still annoying, especially when the break between the second and third chorus in this track is just a few seconds of guitar riffs. They really could have used that break with the guitar solo. But otherwise, it's still a pretty solid track.
I'm happy we went with If Not For You. I think that's one of my favorite songs on the record.
If Not For You is the first song I heard from this album. I believe it was the first single. It's the first somewhat melodic track that we get. At least the first verse is pretty soft. Most of the rest of the track is reasonably heavy. I have to admit, I did not like this song the first couple of times that I heard it, but it has really grown on me a lot. And I do have the same issue with the placement of the guitar solo, although I think this is one of the better solos on the album. I'm going to mention that placement of the guitar solos in every track that he does it. Thrown Further starts off with a pretty heavy and fast-paced intro. The song does tone down once it hits the verse, and I'm not really a big fan of the pacing of the verses. Whenever Mark sings, the music goes into this pacing that reminds me of the build towards a chorus. It just doesn't feel very natural for a verse. And in between those lines of vocals, the song does pick up and get back to a decent pace. The song picks up its pace in the chorus, and while the chorus isn't bad necessarily, this is one of those songs where I feel like that chorus just doesn't really hit like it's supposed to. There is actually a brief guitar solo where one should be this time, which is nice, and another one at the end of the song after the final chorus, which has a pretty cool guitar effect on it. For me, this song is just okay.
I think Let That Be Us is one of my favorites. I thought that was a contender for first single, but I just didn't get the feedback that I wanted for that one. So
Let That Be Us is another song that starts off with a heavy, fast-paced intro that tones it down a little bit for the verses. Overall, I would still say it's a pretty heavy and fast-paced track. The song doesn't really slow down much except during the bridge. This is a song that I like quite a bit, actually. It took some time to grow on me, but once it did, it really stuck with me. The chorus is super catchy, the verses have a decent pacing, and again, that placement of the guitar solo. But other than that, it's a pretty strong track. The Last One of Us is the second melodic track on the album, and the first full-on ballad, with most of the song being played with acoustic guitars. The song has a pretty decent sound to it, and overall it's a pretty decent song, but it feels very safe and predictable. It definitely has that we want this to be a single played on the radio feel to it. It's not bad and certainly a nice change after mostly heavy stuff to this point, but it's nothing exciting or interesting. And again, I have that issue with the placement of the guitar solo. In One Piece is a heavier mid-tempo song. I feel like one of the previous tracks had this same exact intro. The intro being like most of the heavier songs on this album, where it teases something heavier and faster than we actually get. This is a pretty decent song, and I cannot complain about the placement of the guitar solo, so that's nice. This song is a bit unique though. A few of the previous tracks had to grow on me, and this one I liked quite a bit initially, and while I still think it's a pretty good song, I don't like it nearly as much as I did those first couple of times I heard it.
We'll hide in the shadows. Our shelter, our sanctuary.
Yeah, Under the Sun was a very important song for me. That's a song I actually wrote for the last Ultra Bridge record.
Okay.
And we just never had time to get into that one, so I saved it for this project.
I'm going to go ahead and take back what I said earlier in this review about there only being one song I actively dislike by this band. Under the Sun is next, and it's the first of 3 agonizing ballads in a row, and 4 out of 5 songs being ballads. Now this song isn't quite as soft as I remember, primarily it's just the intro and first verse that are soft, but I cannot get into this song at all. There's no guitar solo, I don't think the chorus has a decent melody at all. The second verse feels like there's just not really any effort put into it. Honestly, there's not really anything I like about this track.
In my skin, and I lie here in envy.
Not Afraid to Lose is significantly better than the previous track. The beginning parts to both songs remind me of each other, and I feel that's a little bit too repetitive. But the rest of the song goes into a different direction. This is a significantly softer song than the previous track. I think Mark sounds really good on this song, and I like the bright sounding guitars at the start of this track. But this one overstays its welcome for me. I can't really connect with it, and I just kept waiting for the song to end.
Could it be a bleak point of view? What's left in me, oh, it's killing you.
Unlike the 2 previous tracks, Bleak actually feels like it goes somewhere. This song follows the structure of some of the melodic tracks on this album, where the first verse is pretty soft, and then the rest of the song gets a little bit heavier. I like the acoustic guitars in the first verse. The chorus is really, really good. I feel like this song actually has a decent pacing to it. Again, I complain about the placement of the guitar solo, but I would say this is actually a pretty good song.
Would you know if it might be the end? Would you care if the chance came again?
Would You Kill is a heavier, faster song, and unlike some of the other ones, this song actually keeps its intensity for the most part. The verses are heavier and faster, the chorus is still heavier, still up tempo, but it's a little slower, and the change between the 2 is done pretty nicely. The midsection of the song is instrumental, and the focal point of that midsection is a melody being played on a clean electric guitar. It almost has a little bit of a Creed sound to it, which is kind of interesting, since Mark's kind of gone away from that since the last Creed album. I don't really mind the placement of the guitar solo in this one as much because there is a break in the vocals during that midsection. The chorus is really catchy and really nice, and this is one of my favorite songs on the album.
Once I found out that I was going to be a father again during COVID, the lyrics naturally just came out of me trying to relate to my children. Don't let the world, as dark as it's become right now, change your disposition or change the way you look at the world.
The album ends with the title track, Marching in Time, and this one is a slog to get through. It clocks in at over 7 minutes, and I feel every one of those 7 minutes. In fact, listening to that song again for this review, I didn't even make it through the whole thing. The verses are mostly acoustic. The melodies on the guitars are pretty typical for acoustic Tremonti. I don't really think the chorus is very good. The verses don't do much for me. There's an extended bridge that doesn't do anything for me. It's not as bad as I was thinking the song was, but I still don't like it at all. So while I complained a lot in this review, this album is actually not that bad. I like 7 of the 12 songs, which for a modern album is actually pretty good. I just feel there's not enough change-ups, not a lot of new ideas being thrown in there, and way too many softer songs for my taste. But at the same time, if you're a fan of Tremonti, then there's no reason not to check it out because it's pretty on par with the previous albums. And I don't feel like Tremonti has put out a bad album. Just to be clear, I know I've complained a lot in this review, but I do think this is a pretty decent album. I just feel like the band is capable of so much more.